Let's break it down straight from the hill to your hometown. No spin, no hype, just facts we find. AI's on the case, no truth left behind. Laws are written, deals are made. Who's got your back, who's throwing shade? We cut through the noise, decode the text, keeping it real. Congress in context, Congress in context, shining the light, breaking it down so you know what's right. Policies, votes, who's working for you? We bring the facts, the power is you.
All right, welcome in everyone to Congress in Context. We're going to be taking another deep dive today, and this time we're looking at the Congressional Record from April 2nd, 2025. So we're going to be jumping between the House and the Senate.
A lot going on that day.
There is, but that's why we're here, right? To kind of pick it apart, see what's important, see what kind of trends are going on. And so you don't have to read through pages and pages of dense text.
Like an executive summary of the day in Congress.
Exactly. So let's jump right in, and I think the Senate's a good place to start.
Sounds good.
And as always, it starts with prayer and the Pledge of Allegiance. Senator Grassley was the one that led the Pledge of Allegiance that day. And you know, I always kind of find it interesting to see, you know, the invocation, the Pledge of Allegiance, and then immediately jump into some pretty partisan back and forth.
Yeah, it's like a reminder that no matter how much they might disagree, there is still that shared foundation there,
right?
At least for a few minutes.
Well, yeah, at least for a few minutes. And speaking of disagreements, Senator Grassley immediately kind of comes out swinging. And he brings up the Department of Health and Human Services and their tracking of unaccompanied children.
Big issue.
Huge issue. And he states that HHS wasn't tracking 300,000 of these children.
Wow, that's a big number.
That is a huge number. And he references a Department of Homeland Security Inspector General report. You know, it says that they confirmed failures by the previous administration's Health and Human Services to protect and find these migrant children. Now, you know, just on its face, that's a huge issue.
Well, yeah, I mean, 300,000 kids, that's a lot of kids. And I mean, what does this say about our ability to manage these kinds of situations? You know what I mean? Like, How do we make sure this doesn't happen again?
Right. And it makes you wonder, too, like, what are those failures specifically?
Right.
Is it a data collection issue? Is it a staffing shortage? Is it, you know, something else entirely? But, you know, Senator Grassley goes on to say that, you know, the previous administration was actively obstructing his oversight, reversed an agreement on sharing sponsor information with law enforcement, and that, you know, the previous administration was prioritizing the immigration status of sponsors over the safety of children. So, you know, that's a very politically charged argument to make, but it is an argument that, you know, you hear a lot when we're talking about these border issues, and specifically you know, migrant children. Yeah.
And for listeners, I think it's important to understand that, you know, there's always going to be different perspectives on these issues, you know, and it's important to listen to both sides and really think critically about the information you're getting.
Absolutely. And that's what we're trying to do here. We're not trying to tell you how to think. We're just trying to present the information as we see it and let you come to your own conclusions. Yeah. So now Minority Leader Schumer takes the floor. And he goes on to talk about a variety of topics, everything from the Wisconsin Supreme Court election to Donald Trump's tariffs to, you know, what he called Republican attacks on Senate rules. He even mentioned RFK Jr.'s comments on 9/11. So it was a wide range of topics that he covered.
Yeah, it was kind of a grab bag of different issues.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, it's important to pay attention to what he was saying about, you know, Senate rules, because it really gets at the heart of how the Senate operates.
Right.
And how much power the majority party has.
Exactly.
And he was really critical of what he saw as Republican attempts to kind of change the rules of the game in order to get their way.
Yeah, I mean, specifically, he accused Republicans of being willing to detonate the rules of the Senate to pass tax cuts for billionaires.
Strong words.
Very strong words.
So what does this tell us about the political climate at the time?
Yeah.
You know, are things that tense that they're talking about? You know, detonating the rules of the Senate?
Well, and it's not the first time you've heard those kinds of, you know, phrases used.
Right.
You know, it's definitely a very heated environment in Washington these days. And he went on to say that, you know, making Trump's tax cuts permanent would add $37 trillion to the national debt So, there's a lot of back and forth on the economy, and, this is kind of a theme that we're seeing a lot in these congressional records.
Yeah, and it's not just political rhetoric either.
Yeah.
The national debt is a real concern, and both sides have very different ideas about how to address it. And it's something that affects everyone. Whether you realize it or not, the national debt has a real impact on our economy.
Absolutely. And, he also said that potential cuts to programs for 9/11 first responders was un-American.
Yeah.
So, that was a very strong statement.
Yeah, that's tying it to a very sensitive topic.
Absolutely. And, it's something that, evokes a lot of emotion. And it's definitely a powerful talking point.
So what's the strategy there? Is it to kind of shut down the debate? Or is it to really appeal to people's emotions and get them on his side?
Well, and I think it's a little bit of both. But it's definitely, it's a way to get people's attention, and it's a way to kind of make people think twice about supporting, cuts to these kinds of programs. And then Senator Schumer actually announces that he is putting forward cybersecurity legislation with Senators Kim and Schiff. And this was in response to reports about National Security Advisor Mike Waltz allegedly using a personal Gmail account for official communications.
So this is interesting because it shows how, a seemingly small thing like using a personal email account can actually have pretty big implications.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to national security.
Absolutely. And, it's something that we've seen before. It's not the first time that, the use of personal email accounts for government business has come under scrutiny. But it's definitely something that, in this day and age with, cybersecurity being such a huge issue, it's definitely something that people are paying attention to.
Yeah, and I think it's important for people to realize that, cybersecurity is not just a government issue. It's something that affects everyone.
Yeah.
Everyone who uses the internet is a potential target.
Right.
And so it's really important to be aware of the risks and to take steps to protect yourself.
Right.
And that's something that Congress is grappling with too.
Yeah.
How to balance security with privacy.
Exactly.
And how to make sure that the government is using technology responsibly.
Right. Now, switching gears a little bit, Senator Barrasso really focuses in on border security. He states that the southern border was thrown wide open under the previous administration. And he goes on to say that President Trump and Republicans are determined to stop the surge at both the northern and southern borders. And then he goes on to oppose a Democrat resolution regarding the northern border, claiming it would undermine security efforts with Canada.
Okay, so he's saying the border's wide open, but he's against a resolution to secure it. I'm a little confused.
Well, and, he doesn't really go into great detail, but he does say that, Senate Republicans are moving forward with legislation that contains strong border provisions. So he's basically saying that they have a better way to address the issue.
Okay, but it sounds like he's more focused on the southern border than the northern border?
Well, and that's traditionally been the case. The southern border has always been, a bigger issue when it comes to, border security. But he does mention the northern border as well. And, it's something that, in recent years has become more of a talking point. And then he goes on to talk about activist judges trying to stop President Trump's agenda. And he says that, the left can't achieve their goals through elections or legislation, so they're depending on the judiciary. And, this is a common argument that you hear from conservatives.
Yeah, it's the idea that, the courts are overstepping their bounds.
Yeah.
And that they're trying to legislate from the bench.
Exactly.
And that's something that conservatives are very concerned about.
Yeah.
And liberals would say that, the courts are just trying to uphold the law.
Right.
And that they're trying to protect people's rights.
Right. And so there's always going to be that tension, between the different branches of government and how they interpret the law. Senator Barrasso then goes on to advocate for extending the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act. He says that it would boost small business growth, global competitiveness, and he warns of a potential $4 trillion tax hike if these provisions expire.
Yeah, so this is a classic Republican argument, right?
Yeah.
That tax cuts are good for the economy.
Right.
And that raising taxes will hurt the economy.
Right.
And it's something that they've been saying for a long time.
Exactly.
And they're likely to keep saying it.
Right. Now, Senator Collins actually comes out in support of Senator Kane's resolution to overturn the emergency declaration that was used to impose tariffs on goods from Canada.
Interesting. So a Republican supporting a Democrat resolution, that's not something you see every day.
No. And, she represents Maine, and she goes on to talk about how, the economies of Maine and Canada are very intertwined.
Makes sense.
She gives the examples of, the Twin Rivers paper mill and Maine potato farmers.
Sure.
And, so she's saying that these tariffs would have very real negative impact on her constituents.
Yeah, and it shows how these national level policies can really have very local impacts.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not just abstract. It affects people's lives in very real ways.
Absolutely. Now, Senator Collins did kind of make a point to differentiate between tariffs on Canada versus tariffs on Mexico or China. She said, she hoped for resolution on dairy issues, but she did seem to, be more supportive of tariffs on other countries.
So maybe it's not so much about tariffs in general, but about tariffs on specific countries.
Right, right. And so then this kind of leads into a big debate about tariffs and emergency powers. Senator Kane's SJ Res 37 is at the center of this debate, and he argues that these tariffs are a new sales tax that will increase costs for everyday people. And he even cites Peter Navarro's statement from years past about tariffs potentially raising $6 trillion. He also quotes a Wall Street Journal article that called the previous administration's tariff efforts the dumbest trade war in history.
Pretty strong words.
Very strong words. But he's really hammering home this point that these tariffs are going to hurt average Americans.
Yeah, he's saying it's going to cost people money. And he's using some pretty strong language to make his point. And he's also questioning the legality of these tariffs.
Right. He brings up IEEPA, which is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and he questions why that is being used against an ally like Canada, especially when we have a trade agreement, the USMCA, with Canada.
Right. I mean, you usually think of IEPA being used against, hostile nations.
Right.
Not our ally.
Right, right. And so then he kind of goes through a bunch of different examples of how these tariffs are impacting businesses. He talks about, pie tin manufacturers, steel for ships and submarines in Virginia.
So he's giving very specific examples to illustrate his point. It's not just theoretical, it's actually hurting businesses.
Right. And then he goes on to talk about the impact on tourism. He says that Canadian air reservations to the U.S. were down 75%. And so he's really painting a picture of, how these tariffs are having a ripple effect throughout the economy.
Yeah, and it's not just about, the direct cost of the tariffs. It's about the indirect costs as well. Lost business, the lost jobs.
Right. And then he brings up fentanyl, which has been a big issue. But he says it's not a Canadian emergency justifying these tariffs.
So he's acknowledging that fentanyl is a problem, but he's saying that these tariffs are not the solution.
Right. And he also points to the fact that, the previous administration was seemingly divided on this issue. That even within the administration, there wasn't agreement on whether or not these tariffs were justified.
So that weakens their argument, right? If they can't even agree amongst themselves.
Right, right. And then he shares this really interesting story about the Haskell Free Library and Opera House, which is on the U.S.-Canada border. And it kind of straddles the border.
Really?
Yeah. And he's using it as a symbol of international cooperation and how, these increased tensions are threatening that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really powerful image, this library that's literally on the border.
Yeah.
And it's a symbol of the friendship between our two countries. And so to see that threatened by these tariffs is really concerning.
Right. And then Senator Kane goes on to point out that he has broad bipartisan support for SJ Res 37. He even lists the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the AFL-CIO as supporters. So he's really trying to show that this is not just a partisan issue.
Yeah, he's saying that this is something that affects everyone.
Yeah.
And that there's a lot of opposition to these tariffs from both sides of the aisle.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see how the vote goes.
Absolutely. Now, Senator Wyden, he speaks next. And he is vehemently opposed to the tariffs.
Okay.
He calls them taxes paid by American consumers. He points out that 8 million American jobs are dependent on trade with Canada. And he also mentions Canada's retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods. So he's really painting this picture of, how this is going to hurt the economy.
Yeah, he's saying that this is going to be bad for everyone. That it's going to lead to higher prices, job losses, and economic recession. And he's calling on Congress to reclaim its authority over tariffs.
Right. And then Senator Tuberville, he actually speaks in favor of tariffs he says, our people are going broke due to unfair trade practices. So you can see how, there's this kind of, different perspectives on this issue and how, people are coming at it from different angles.
Yeah, it's a classic clash of ideologies, free trade versus protectionism. And it's a debate that's been going on for a long time. And it's not likely to be resolved anytime soon.
Right. Senator Collins, she comes back in and expresses concern about the economic chaos that's been created by the previous administration's policies. She talks about rising prices for everything from eggs to mortgages.
So she's saying that these tariffs are actually hurting the people they're supposed to be helping, that they're leading to higher prices for everyone.
Right. And then Senator Kaine kind of reiterates this point that less than 1% of fentanyl intercepted at the U.S. border comes from Canada. So he's really trying to, kind of dispel this myth that Canada is the source of the fentanyl problem.
Right. He's saying that it's a much bigger issue than that.
Yeah.
And that these tariffs are not going to solve it.
Right. And then Senator Klobuchar comes out in strong support of Senator Kaine's resolution. Yeah. She actually calls the tariffs a national sales tax day. She says that it could cost the average family $5,000 a year. She talks about the negative impact on the stock market, tourism from Canada. And she really emphasizes how important Canada is as a trading partner.
So she's hitting on all the key points, the economic impact, the impact on consumers, the impact on our relationship with Canada. She's making a very strong case against these tariffs.
Right. And then Senator Welch from Vermont also expresses his support for the resolution. He talks about the potential impact on Vermont's economy, everything from fertilizer to maple sugar equipment to heating fuel to gasoline. And he even shares concerns from Vermont businesses and farmers. So you can really see how this is, affecting people on a very local level.
Yeah, it's a reminder that these national level policies have very real consequences for people on the ground. It's not just abstract. It affects people's lives in very concrete ways.
Absolutely. And then Senator Shaheen from New Hampshire shares similar concerns. She talks about, small businesses in New Hampshire losing business because Canadian tourists are canceling their plans. She even mentions the potential closure of a bakery because of the tariffs. She also talks about the potential for higher home heating and gasoline prices. So, again, just another example of, how this is having a ripple effect throughout the economy.
Yeah, and it's interesting how she's tying it to very specific things like a bakery closing. It makes it very real for people. It's not just about abstract economic numbers.
Right. And then Senator Warner, he comes out in strong support of the resolution. He criticizes the America alone approach. He really emphasizes Canada's longstanding friendship and alliance with the U.S.
So he's appealing to, the historical ties between our two countries, that we've been allies for a long time. And that we should be working together, not against each other.
Right. And then Senator Van Hollen, he calls the previous administration's tariffs a national sales tax that betrays the American people. He says that it's going to lead to higher prices and potential retaliation from other countries, which could lead to job losses. And he also notes that, the proceeds from these tariffs could be used to offset tax cuts for the wealthy. So he's really kind of, painting a picture of how this is, benefiting the wealthy at the expense of everyone else.
Yeah, he's saying that this is a regressive policy, that is going to hurt the poor and the middle class the most, and that is going to benefit the rich. And that's a message that resonates with a lot of people.
Right. And then Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut, he talks about the potential devastating consequences for Connecticut's economy and jobs due to these tariffs. He says that Canada is a major trading partner and that these tariffs are going to hurt Connecticut businesses.
So again, it's another example of how these national level policies can have very local impacts.
Right.
And it's something that, senators are very aware of, because they represent their states, and they want to make sure that their states are not being hurt by these policies.
Right. And then Senator Paul, he gives a very interesting speech. He says that taxation without representation is tyranny.
Wow. Going back to the American Revolution there.
Yeah. And he argues that the Constitution grants the power to tax to Congress, not the president. So he's basically saying that these tariffs are unconstitutional.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement.
It is. And he goes on to say that tariffs are taxes that harm the economy, that they raise prices. And he highlights Canada's importance as a U.S. customer. And he even cites estimates of how much these tariffs are going to cost American families.
So he's making a very strong case against these tariffs?
Right. And then we kind of move on to some more procedural matters. Senator Rounds, makes a unanimous consent request to waive quorum calls on nominations. And this includes the nomination of Dean Sauer to be Solicitor General of the United States. There's also a cloture motion filed on this nomination. And then there's a motion to invoke cloture on the nomination of Harmeet Dillon as Assistant Attorney General. And then there's a unanimous consent agreement regarding the confirmation times for these nominations.
Okay, so a lot of procedural stuff there. But it's important to understand how this all works because it affects which nominations get voted on and when.
Right. And it's, it's all part of the legislative process. And then Senator Schumer raises some serious concerns about the nomination of Edward Martin as U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. He really highlights Mr. Martin's leadership in the Stop the Steal movement.
Okay, so this is getting into some pretty controversial territory.
It is. He mentions Mr. Martin's presence at the Capitol on January 6th, his downplaying of the violence that occurred that day. And then he brings up some past statements where Mr. Martin reportedly labeled federal prosecutors as terrorists.
Wow, that's pretty serious stuff.
It is. And he goes on to detail Mr. Martin's alleged praise and ties to an individual described as a white supremacist and Nazi sympathizer. And this individual was involved in the January 6th riot. Senator Schumer also mentions that Mr. Martin has threatened to prosecute government employees, members of Congress, and press outlets.
So he's painting a picture of someone who's very extreme in his views and who's potentially dangerous.
Right. And he calls for a special hearing for Mr. Martin before the Senate Judiciary Committee.
So this is definitely something to keep an eye on. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out.
Absolutely. And then Senator Moody comes back in and she addresses the fentanyl crisis. And she acknowledges that Canada is not the primary source of fentanyl, but she does say that cartels are using the northern border to transport fentanyl and people illegally after Canada eased visa restrictions.
So she's saying that it's still a problem, even though Canada is not the main source of fentanyl.
Right, and she cites a 60-minute story about a smuggler moving significant quantities of fentanyl across the Canadian border into the U.S. She talks about the vulnerability of the U.S.-Canada border and the fact that a high percentage of terror watch list suspects encountered at land border ports came across the northern border.
So she's raising some serious security concerns.
Right, and she stresses the need for more resources for law enforcement on the northern border. And she notes that the amount of fentanyl precursors that have been interdicted in Canada has been increasing.
So it sounds like it's a growing problem.
It does. And then Senator Rounds comes back in, and he discusses a bipartisan effort in the House to address the statute of limitations on prosecuting unemployment insurance fraud that occurred during the pandemic. He cites the Inspector General's identification of $191 billion in inappropriately distributed funds.
Wow, that's a huge amount of money.
It is. And Senator Wyden, he expresses some concerns about the narrow proposal, and he advocates for a larger solution to unemployment insurance issues.
So he agrees that fraud is a problem, but he wants to see a more comprehensive approach to addressing it.
Right. And then Senator Rounds argues that they need to address the criminal fraud cases where the statute of limitations is expiring. But he says that they're going to continue to work on a broader solution.
So it sounds like there's some common ground there, but they're still working out the details.
Right. And then Senator Blumenthal, he comes back in and he condemns calls to impeach federal judges who have ruled against President Trump. He references Trump's tweet about Judge James Boasberg and Elon Musk's comments, and he highlights the separation of powers and the role of the judiciary in upholding the Constitution.
So he's defending the independence of the judiciary.
Right, and he points out that there have been numerous lawsuits against the previous administration over allegedly unconstitutional executive orders, and he emphasizes that impeachment is reserved for grave ethical or criminal misconduct, not disagreement with judicial rulings.
So he's saying that people should respect the role of the judiciary even if they disagree with their rulings.
Right. And he also discusses alleged efforts to intimidate lawyers and law firms representing clients in cases against President Trump.
So he's saying that there's a campaign to silence critics of the previous administration.
Right. And then we kind of wrap things up in the Senate with a unanimous consent request by Senator Thune regarding SJ Res 37. There are some orders for Senate business on Thursday, April 3rd, 2025. This includes consideration of HJ Res 24, the Sauer nomination, a cloture vote on the Mehmet Oz nomination, and potential votes on motions to discharge SJ Res 33 and SJ Res 26. So just a lot of procedural stuff to kind of set the stage for the next day.
Yeah, just Keeping the wheels of government turning.
Exactly. Now let's jump over to the House of Representatives.
Thank God.
Their day begins, as always, with a prayer by the House chaplain.
Reverend Margaret Grun Kippen.
That's right. And then, of course, the approval of the journal of the previous day's proceedings and the Pledge of Allegiance.
So pretty standard opening procedures.
Very standard. But then we get a communication from the Florida Department of State regarding the election of the Honorable Randy Fine as representative for Florida's 6th Congressional District in a special general election that was held on April 1st, 2025.
So a new member of Congress.
Yes. And the Speaker congratulates Mr. Fine and other recently elected members of the 119th Congress.
So a little bit of pomp and circumstance.
Always. And then we get some member statements from Mr. Petronas of Florida and, of course, the newly elected Mr. Fine.
Both from Florida.
Yes. And Mr. Petronas expresses his honor to represent Florida's 1st congressional district and his readiness to support President Trump's agenda.
So setting the tone right away.
Right. And then Mr. Fine talks about his family's support and his belief in a divine plan involving President Trump.
Okay, so definitely aligning himself with the president.
Absolutely. And then we get into the introduction of some bills and joint resolutions. This includes H.R. 2615, which was introduced by Mr. Womack and others to prohibit the sale of unsafe poppy seeds.
Poppy seeds.
Yes. This goes to the Committee on Energy and Commerce.
Interesting.
And then we have H.J. Res. 87, which was introduced by Mr. James and others, providing congressional disapproval of an EPA rule related to California's vehicle pollution control standards.
So getting into environmental policy there.
Right. And that also goes to the Committee on Energy and Commerce. And then there are a whole bunch of other House bills introduced. These are H.R. 2593 through H.R. 2602. And each one of these bills cites constitutional authority for enactment, primarily Article 1, Section 8.
So laying the groundwork for their legislative proposals.
Exactly. And then we get a listing of additional co-sponsors for various House resolutions and Senate resolutions.
So building support for their bills.
Right. And then we get to a section called Extensions of Remarks.
Okay, what's that?
So this is where members can add statements and tributes to the official record. And there's a wide range of topics covered here. We have a statement honoring the legacy of Congresswoman Nita M. Lowy.
Paying tribute to a former colleague?
Right. There's a tribute to Zachary Northcutt for his promotion to lieutenant commander in the Navy.
Recognizing military service.
Right. There's a statement recognizing the North Dakota boys class of basketball champions from Kindred High School.
Celebrating local achievements.
Right. There's a statement congratulating Rochelle Martinez Marentes, Valeria Shons Alvarado, and Nayeli Andazola for achieving the Arvada Wheat Ridge Service Ambassadors for Youth Award.
Honoring young people who are making a difference.
Right. There's a statement commemorating Jocko Realtor's 50th anniversary.
Marking a business milestone.
Right. There's a statement recognizing Veronica Quizzato for earning the Arvada Wheat Ridge Service Ambassadors for Youth Award.
Another outstanding young person.
Right. There's a statement recognizing April as National Autism Awareness Month and acknowledging Vincent McLaughlin's advocacy.
Raising awareness for an important cause.
Right. There's a statement remembering Patricia Ferris for her contributions to the Indian Wells Valley community.
Honoring someone who made a difference in their community.
Right. And then finally, there's a statement recognizing Cristel Cumeso.
Okay, so a wide range of topics being covered here.
Yeah. And, this is just a small sampling of what's in the Congressional Record. But it gives you an idea of the kind of things that members of Congress are talking about and how they're using their platform to recognize people and events in their districts.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that Congress is more than just about passing laws.
Right. It's about representing people.
Exactly.
And then we get a listing of Senate committee meetings that are scheduled for April 8th and April 10th, 2025. This includes meetings of the Armed Services Committee, the Appropriations Committee, and the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Committee.
So the work of Congress continues.
It does. And then we get some information on a House Oversight and Accountability Committee hearing on reducing waste, fraud, and abuse through AI.
So looking at how technology can be used to improve government efficiency.
Right. And then we get a list of committee hearings that were held on April 2nd. This includes a Judiciary Subcommittee hearing on artificial intelligence, examining trends in innovation and competition.
So exploring the implications of AI.
Right. And then there was a Judiciary Subcommittee on Oversight hearing on inside the Biden FBI, waste, fraud, abuse, and a bureau leadership in decline.
So holding the FBI accountable.
Right. So very busy day in Congress.
It sounds like it.
Lots of debate, lots of discussion, lots of legislation being introduced.
A lot for listeners to think about. How do these events shape our understanding of the political landscape, and what are the implications for policy and governance going forward?
Right. And what can citizens do to stay informed and engaged?